With us today, we have two speakers, Amanda Dick Petty, Budget Director of the New Mexico House of Representatives, and Yadira Sanchez, Parent Leader at Partnership for Community Action and business owner Pequeños Corazones Daycare. Amanda Dick Petty, Budget Director of the New Mexico House of Representatives, thank you for joining us today and for starting us off. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone again. My name is Amanda Dick Petty. I'm really excited to be here this morning. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just talking through some high-level things about the New Mexico state budget, some key investments that we've made this last legislative session, and some ways that the New Mexico state budget is unique from maybe other states or other budgets you might be familiar with. So first of all, we'll do a quick overview of New Mexico's budget and our process. So for New Mexico finances, the New Mexico General Fund, which is what I'll be focusing on mostly this morning, has grown tremendously in recent years. So for some context, a few years ago in 2019, the whole state budget was about $6.8 billion. This last budget that the legislature just approved was over $10.2 billion. So we've basically, almost doubled our budget in just a few years, which is incredible. It gives the legislature a ton of opportunity to make key investments in families and in much needed areas for the state. In addition to that $10.2 billion for recurring things like funding schools, like funding state agencies, there's also a lot of one-time money that the legislature appropriates. And that can be for special projects that will only last 1 to 2 years, for statewide infrastructure, for roads, for parks, for things like that, as well as some pockets of money for individual legislators to bring back to their communities, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Some key points about New Mexico's finances, I'm sure a lot of you know, but a large portion of the state revenue comes from oil and gas royalties, and that includes most of the funding for local infrastructure. Again, as you all probably know, oil and gas revenue relies heavily on a sort of boom and bust economy. So it's not always a very stable source of revenue. In the past, that's led to the state having to make some really big, cuts to the budget and then increase it sharply. And it's often been called a roller coaster, which has been really hard for the state to maintain critical programs because you never know what the state budget is going to be. In recent years, though, we've gotten away from some of that instability, and the legislature has taken steps to create more stability through other mechanisms. So I always share this graph, but I won't spend too much time talking about it. This is an overview of New Mexico state finances. It comes from the Legislative Finance Committee, and it's just a really good kind of way to map out where some of this money is. So again, you see under operating funds, the general fund, which is what I'll be talking most about today. And you can see what goes into that. So there's taxes and miscellaneous fees, which is about 60%, interest from investments, about 14%, and then energy, which is, that oil and gas money. On this chart, that's listed as 23.7%. It's a little funky because some of the taxes, some of that first line is also from oil and gas. But it is a good representation. This is from last year, so it's about 9.5 billion. That's grown. And then we have our road fund right below that. That is a fund that obviously funds state and local roads. And then circled here in the investments column is the land grant permanent fund. And I won't go into too much detail about everything else, but this fund is very unique to New Mexico. And you can see there that it's at about $27.9 billion as of last year. So the Land Grant Permanent Fund is one of many permanent funds that the state has. because of that unstable revenue in the past, the state has really focused on creating these kind of big bank accounts. And this is the biggest one by a lot. And it's also the oldest one. It was part of the Land Grant Act from the federal Congress in anticipation of New Mexico becoming a state. But it's again valued at that $27.9 billion. And that makes it the second largest fund in the United States and one of the largest sovereign funds in the world. So this is probably no surprise to a lot of you all in the advocacy space, but if you hear that New Mexico is a poor state, we're really not. We're sitting on one of the biggest pots of money, in the world. And the money in this fund is, it's invested, so it grows over time. And some of it is earmarked for special purposes. Some of those are, schools, some are public universities, and some is for early childhood education, which is recent, and we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the fund is also constitutionally protected. So the legislature can't tap into this fund anytime they want. This fund is in the Constitution, and in order to get money out of this fund for a purpose, the legislature has to pass an initiative to put it on the ballot, and voters and community members have to approve that purpose for the fund. So a little more on some of the process. New Mexico has a very, very unique budget process, and it makes it kind of hard to understand. We're one of the only states in the US that does a dual budgeting process. So in a lot of states, really the governor kind of drives the ship. And they create a budget request or a budget recommendation, and then the legislature either, adds or takes away from that. In New Mexico, it's very different. So a consensus group of economists decide what budget numbers everyone's going to work with. So we have economists from the governor's team, from the legislators' team, from the State Investment Council, and they all get together and they come to one number, which that by itself is very unique. And then both the legislature, usually driven by the Legislative Finance Committee, as well as the governor, publish a recommendation for the budget. But in New Mexico, lawmakers typically start with the legislative recommendation as a baseline. So we're not starting with what the governor wants and building or taking away. We're really more starting with the legislature's recommendation and building to get closer to some of those governor's initiatives, as well as member initiatives, of course. All changes to the budget occur during session. Session in our state is only ever 30 days or 60 days, unless there's a special session. And New Mexico must have a balanced budget according to the state constitution. So we have to make sure that we're not appropriating more than that number that everyone agreed upon, and we have to do it all in either 30 or 60 days. Of course, there's some work that happens in the fall for that, but the bulk of the decision making does happen during session, and it's all decided by the time session ends. A couple other funding sources outside of, this kind of typical agency school funding. One is the GROW Fund, and that stands for the Government Results and Opportunity Fund. And although this acronym, this name of the fund is brand new this year, this is something that the legislature has done in the past. And essentially what this is in years where there's a ton of new revenue, each member is allocated a little pot of money to spend for projects they are interested in, usually in their community. This is a great revenue source for organizations and for nonprofit service providers and other entities that might need state support, but on a smaller scale. Some examples of how this fund was used, even just this last session, include projects for local domestic violence shelters, local homelessness initiatives, scholarship opportunities to, grow the number of social workers in the state, and bilingual education opportunities. And then this year, for the very first time, this fund was incorporated into the bigger budget. And that sounds kind of, common sense, but this is the first time that's ever happened. Previously, it was in a separate bill. It was kind of not really paid attention to. And this year, legislative leadership decided, no, all the appropriations are going to be in the budget because it's all a priority. Another revenue source that I could do a whole nother 15-minute presentation on is what we call capital outlay. And this is how we tend to fund smaller infrastructure projects in our state. Individual legislators, usually receive funds for infrastructure projects, at least in recent years when there has been more state money, and we call that capital outlay. This can be used for a wide variety of things, from improving community parks to funding critical water infrastructure. So these are very important funds. And typically we use typically in the last few years, we've used general fund for this, but we can also use oil and gas severance tax revenue for this. So again, this is something to look at as the state tries to move away from that unstable oil and gas money, as to think about how we're going to fund these infrastructure projects. So now that you have kind of an overview of the budget, I'll go through a few slides on how the budget is working for New Mexico families and communities. The areas that we'll look at mostly are the career, technical education, and workforce, early childhood care and education, healthcare, K through 12 education, and then higher education. So we will start with workforce training and career technical education. This was one of the biggest investments that the legislature made this last session. They invested historic amounts of money in different workforce and career training at all levels, which we'll talk about. So the first big push, the first big funding was over $40 million invested in career technical education, or CTE, and that's at schools. And so what this does is this funds classes at public schools that, middle schoolers and high schoolers can access for really cool skill building, like classes on welding, classes on agriculture, classes in healthcare, and a lot more. And so what this does is this gives our students an opportunity, completely free, to explore these fields such as welding, such as agriculture, that maybe they don't need to go to college for, but can earn a high salary doing. And this early exposure is really, really important. And it was a huge priority of the legislature this year. Next, which goes hand in hand with this, is the creation of an apprenticeship fund. So the legislature appropriated $30 million to an apprenticeship fund, which is going to create another pipeline for kids or folks, leaving those oil and gas jobs who want to use their skills or learn new skills to get into a new industry, to get into apprenticeships, to get into union work, and to access those high-paying jobs that we know are desperately needed in our state. New Mexico actually has one of the biggest shortages for tradespeople in the nation. So we know we need these workers, and this is another opportunity to create more workers in our state. And then lastly, there was $20 million to the Higher Education Department for workforce training. And these could be apprenticeships, these could be certificates, these could be other endorsements for a wide range of things. And the important element of this is that it's not tied to any federal funding or guidelines. So we know that that there's FAFSA and there's a lot of federal opportunities, but those dollars often come with restrictions that, maybe folks who aren't citizens can't access these programs. Folks who aren't in college full-time can't access it. This money allows all of our community members equal access to those really important opportunities. And then I'll talk a little bit about early childhood education and care. This is huge in our state. After a decades-long fight from advocates, policy experts, and legislators, New Mexico has really become a national model for state investment into early childhood programs. So just a timeline. In 2019, the state, again, after a long fight, created the Early Childhood Education and Care Department. That's a cabinet level department to oversee the continuum of early childhood services in our state, from home visiting to childcare to pre-K. So huge deal to sort of have one entity helping oversee those things. Then in 2020, the legislature created the Early Childhood Education Trust Fund to help fund these programs. That was seeded with $300 million, which sounds like a lot of money and is a lot of money. But since 2020, that fund has now grown to over $5.5 billion. So this is another example of our state, creating a savings fund and then getting a great return on that investment. But now the legislature gets to decide, how do we want to use that historic revenue to invest in our children and our families? Then in 2022, New Mexicans voted to amend the Constitution to use that land grant permanent fund we talked about a little bit earlier to support early childhood education in perpetuity. So that means no matter what that oil and gas revenue does, we are funding early childhood education and care for our kids, which is a huge deal in our state. All these investments and the federal investments that New Mexico has been able to leverage brings the total investment into our children's and families through just this department to almost $1 billion annually. So that's not $1 billion over 4 years. That's $1 billion every single year that we put into this. Another key area, of course, is healthcare and human services. This year, the legislature invested almost $500 million into a new healthcare authority department, and that department's going to do a lot of things. One is expanding SNAP benefits, especially for our elders, so they can have access to nutritious food. One is increasing provider rates to recruit and retain healthcare workers. We know we need healthcare workers in our state, especially behavioral healthcare workers. So that was one initiative. Also, creating one entity to negotiate the best price on insurance. We know insurance costs are going up for people, and so this should help negotiate those prices down. We increase services for veterans and other elder care as well, including meal delivery for our seniors, community care, which enables them to age within their communities, and outreach to folks so that they know about these services. Another key healthcare budget element is in 2021, the legislature created the Healthcare Affordability Fund. And that fund, again, provides healthcare to people not eligible for typical plans. So if you get kicked off of Medicaid, this fund should help you access healthcare. If you're undocumented, this fund would help you access healthcare. It should also, help small businesses and decrease out-of-pocket expenses as well. So we're getting towards the end here. For K through 12 education, New Mexico is actually one of the only states that fully funds education at the state level. So we don't do mill levies to fund at least educational operations, which means there's no funding disparity between, a wealthier community and a not so wealthy community, which is huge. And because of this, it's one of the biggest parts of our budget. The legislature spends about $4.4 billion, which is about 40% of the budget on education, on K through 12 education, not even higher ed, which we'll get to here in a second. So some key initiatives in education. One really big one that the legislature has worked on in the past couple of years is free lunch for every single kid in New Mexico. So the legislature appropriated about $30 million for that last year, and then this year appropriated another $40 million to ensure that no matter what, if you signed up for free lunch or not, no matter what your income status, our kids have access to free lunch at schools and free healthy lunch. That's what the additional $40 million was for, is to ensure that those lunches are sourcing local vegetables, meeting nutritional guidelines. Other big investments in our students include an additional $6 million for special education funding, funding innovative education. That includes community schools, outdoor classrooms, out of school learning, so extracurriculars and other sort of out of the box education ideas. There's also $30 million, so a huge investment for summer reading programs to make sure our kids can read, and $3 million for targeted and culturally appropriate education, including funds towards Black education and the Hispanic and Indian Education Act. And to continue on education, we know that for good education, we can't just support our students, we also have to support our teachers. So the legislature has consistently increased teacher pay in our state, which has led to New Mexico being one of the highest in the tri-state area. So for a long time, we were really far behind, and we're finally starting to catch up. Other cool initiatives is $20 million for teacher residency to grow our own teachers in our state. $2.5 million for training opportunities to, give teachers better tools to teach reading, to teach math. And then $20 million in endowments at higher education institutions to support teaching programs. So again, to make sure folks are interested in teaching and have access to scholarships to make that happen. So that brings us to higher education, which is the last topic that I'll cover before we open it up for some questions. In 2022, the legislature funded the Opportunity Scholarship Program, making the state the first in the nation to enact free higher education for all New Mexico residents, which is huge. And this initiative enables students to return to school, which is a really big part of it. Previous scholarship opportunities in the state had requirements that you go to school right after high school. So if you graduate high school and you have to work, or you graduate high school and you want to travel or take a year off, you automatically lose that scholarship opportunity. Well, the legislature changed that. Not anymore. You can take some time off, you can be a returning student and still have 100% of your undergraduate tuition covered. In previous years, the legislature sort of funded this year by year. So one year they would say, okay, I think we need $40 million to fund this program. And then the next year they'd need more. But again, as we've talked about, with revenue sources being uncertain, that wasn't a sustainable way to fund this. So this last year, the legislature said, you know what, this is a top priority for our state. We're going to create a $1 billion higher education trust fund that, again, another savings account, and we're going to make sure that this program is funded well into the future. And then some other investments in higher education that are really cool include $40 million for social work endowments and stipends. This funding is incredible because it says not only are we going to fund scholarships for people who want to become social workers in our state, which we know we really need, but we will pay you. We'll pay you while you're doing your clinicals. We'll pay you while you're doing your practicums to pursue this degree. $10 million for nurses, $15 million for healthcare professional repayment programs. So if you're a healthcare professional and you took out a loan, the state has more money to help pay back those loans and forgive those loans. $10 million for graduate student scholarships, $1 million for dual credits. So our high school kids can earn college credits in high school for free, which is also an incredible program. And then $10 million into the what we call Technology Enhancement Fund, which is really just a fund to support entrepreneurs. So if someone in New Mexico at a higher education institution has a great idea but needs some help building it out and planning it, this fund can help do that. So I did link here, I know this will be posted, some additional resources and some of the places where I got the graphs that were here. That includes the New Mexico Voices for Children budget guide. I think this is a really helpful way of understanding the budget, and then some finance committee documents. And that is all I have, and I would love to turn it over either for questions or for our second speaker.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for sharing the overview of the New Mexico's dual budget process and also for sharing that New Mexico has doubled its budget in the past years and the positive impact it's having in the community and how overall the Land Grant Permanent Fund also supports this work. And I just want to highlight that you said that New Mexico was catching up, but I think with everything that you all are doing and free higher education for all New Mexico residents, that also sets a great standard to reach for the rest of the country. So now everyone else has to catch up. And now that we've learned about the process, we also want to ensure we hear from how the community experiences all of this. And as I mentioned before, we are happy to have Yadira Sanchez, parent leader at Partnership for Community Action and business owner Pequeños Corazones Daycare, with us today. She will share with us her testimonial and the effects of the budget on parents and on early child care providers. Thank you, Yadira.
Hola, mi nombre es Yadira Sánchez. Estoy apoyando a los padres líderes en PCA con las regularizaciones para abrir sus daycare y las personas que tienen poco tiempo en tener su guardería. También las apoyo con cualquier documentación que se necesite, cualquier guía. Pues mi nombre es Yadira Sánchez, soy directora y dueña de Pequeños Corazones Daycare Home y atiendo a niños de 0 a 12 años. Estoy por 7 años ya con este servicio en la comunidad y estaba escuchando todo el presupuesto de Amanda. Está muy interesante. Qué suave que todo ese dinero llegue a nuestros daycare. Pero sabemos que podemos compartir con toda la comunidad para que todos seamos fluyentes y que seamos perseverantes en nuestra rama. Durante este tiempo, pues he visto cómo ha evolucionado todo lo de la primera infancia. Con este presupuesto pienso que mejorando los salarios de las maestras va a ser de mucho apoyo para así retener a las maestras. Uno de los beneficios que todavía no cuento con ellos es el de cuidado médico que me gustaría ofrecerle a las empleadas. Pienso que con ese presupuesto y el aumento salarial que viene próximamente para nuestros contratos, pienso que voy a poder apoyar así a las familias. También pienso que va a contribuir mucho este presupuesto para las familias trabajadoras de Nuevo México, para que ellas puedan establecerse en sus trabajos, ya que ponen a sus niños en un lugar seguro para ellas hacer su trabajo de 9 o 10 horas. Es mucho apoyo que más familias puedan calificar para los contratos de subsidio del Estado y así de esa forma le dan estabilidad a las familias, contribuyen a la economía del Estado y también para mí, como para mi familia, también me dan estabilidad de trabajo, le doy estabilidad a las trabajadoras. Me nació la inquietud de abrir otra localidad donde tengo 5 empleadas también y eso creo que va a ayudar bastante a que esas familias sean beneficiadas con este presupuesto para que lleven el sustento a sus hogares. Y la educación de los niños va evolucionando en Nuevo México. Me da mucho gusto ser uno de los primeros estados que dicen, no, estamos ya poniéndonos en el nivel de otros estados en muchos aspectos como de pobreza. Ya estamos en un 90, ya estamos en muy alto como es el 400% para que las familias califican cuando ellos aplican en sus contratos al Estado. Pienso que también se van a beneficiar mucho las familias de bebés, ya que, ya que los bebés necesitan mucho apoyo las familias porque en algunos momentos las familias no tienen para comprar pañales o wipes y con esta ayuda del Estado para que más familias califiquen para los contratos, pienso que las familias van a tener la oportunidad de llegar, de ponerle las necesidades a sus hijos, las necesidades básicas. Estoy muy contenta por esto, me estoy muy contenta que me hayan invitado y es todo lo que yo tengo que compartir para ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Yadira, por compartir el impacto que el presupuesto tiene en la comunidad y también la visión que usted tiene de seguir creciendo con los centros para seguir ayudando y beneficiar a familias que tienen bebés en los centros de cuidado. La siguiente porción. So thank you, Yadira, for sharing about how the budget will have an impact on families and just overall how you also have a vision of growing and having more centers for daycares and supporting the families that have babies. The second portion of this is that we will go into Q&A. So I have questions both for Amanda and also for Yadira. La siguiente parte tengo preguntas para Amanda y también para usted, señora Yadira. Voy a empezar con Amanda y después continúo con la señora Yadira. So I will start with Amanda. The first question is, how does this year's budget impact immigrant families in New Mexico?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this budget, along with last year's budget, because of our legislative leadership, is one of the most impactful for immigrant families. And I think that's through the early childhood education stuff that we talked about, making more money available. So like Yadira said, families have a safe place to put their kids while they're working. As well as the workforce opportunities. So again, anyone, regardless of your immigration status, can access these skill building tools that the legislature funded. And through our public education systems, we know that education is really, really important. So there's still work to be done, but the legislature has made huge investments for immigrant families, and I think there's a commitment to keep doing so.
Thank you. Señora Yadira, ¿de qué manera le beneficia a su negocio que el Estado de Nuevo México esté invirtiendo más fondos en la educación temprana? In what ways does your business benefit from the investment New Mexico is making in early childhood?
De la forma que me está beneficiando es mantener el personal, ya que anteriormente no podía yo sostener el personal por los bajos salarios. Ahorita podemos tener un salario más o menos y con este aumento pensamos que vamos a tener muy buenos resultados para así tener a los empleados necesarios y que retenerlos, ofreciéndoles beneficios y podamos trabajar juntos y podamos sacar a Nuevo México.
Muchísimas gracias. Amanda, we have some questions for you in the chat. So will these vocations, when you were talking about the CTE, will these vocations be available in all high schools and will be mandatory for all APS schools to have in their schools?
That's another very good question. The goal is for these to be available in all high schools. A lot of high schools already have programs like this, and the goal is to supplement those existing programs and make it possible to create new programs. At the state level, the legislature can't mandate that APS make all of these available because our schools have local control. Our school boards have a lot of say over that. And even the public education department has a lot of say about how those funds are distributed. So we try to work very closely with the public education department, with APS, with other localities to make those as available as possible, but the legislature can't mandate that APS, make it super widely available.
Thank you. Señora Yadira, ¿Qué mensaje le quiere mandar a la comunidad que está participando en este taller? ¿Cómo pueden involucrarse en este trabajo? What message would you like to send the community participating in the session today? How can they get involved in this work?
Llenando las encuestas que nos manda ICECD para ser escuchados, para ver las necesidades y basado en las necesidades poder hacer decisiones como estas del presupuesto.
Muchísimas gracias. So just to highlight that, she did state that it's like completing the surveys that you all get sent. And then I will transition. This is like a two questions for you, Amanda. The first is, how does this year's budget compare to prior year's budget with regard to investments in children and families? And then we also have another question about the legislature has made significant investments that benefit families and children. How can families and organizations get involved in the implementation of the budget and programs it's creating? If we don't see the programs reaching families and kids, who do we contact to advocate to ensure the resources are reaching and impacting our families?
Okay, I will do the first question. This year's budget for children and families compared to previous years. Again, since 2019, I think the legislature has really made big investments in children and families through the early childhood education department, through increases for our public schools and for our teachers. But I will say this year is probably the biggest, well, not probably, it's definitely the biggest investment in our state's history. And part of why this year is so much bigger is because that constitutional amendment, that now we have a constitutionally mandated source of revenue for early childhood education. That was an additional $250 million for education, for early childhood education this year. So it's growing. There's been a trend to invest more in children and families, but this year is definitely the biggest yet, which is great. For the second question, I believe it was how do we ensure that the money that's appropriated is getting to our families, and who do we contact if it's not? So that is probably, from my experience in the legislature, as a staffer for the legislature, one of the hardest things is the legislature can appropriate the money, but making sure that it's reaching communities is hard, and we have less oversight over that. So I would say, again, we're getting better every year. I think there's a lot of oversight that the legislature does to ask those questions. But if you feel that you're not seeing results from this funding, I would recommend, using your community organizations that you're familiar with. I would recommend those surveys you're talking about, and feel free. I put my contact information. Reach out to me, reach out to us. We are a resource for that, and we can ask those hard questions if we need to.
One additional question for you, Amanda. What is your message to families listening with regard to how they can add their voice to the budget making process, and how can they get involved?
Yeah, so the legislature has tried to become more transparent, and one way that we do that is through our interim committee meetings. So I'll make sure I'll send it to Christina. There's the legislative website that talks about, that publishes where interim committees are meeting. Go to those meetings, advocate at those meetings, do public comment, find your legislator, reach out to your legislator. I found that our legislators are very accessible compared to other states. So you have a voice. Again, you can use me, you can use the speaker's office. He's very committed to making sure that we have community input, and encourage us to get better at it. We're always growing, and we're happy to hear input.
Thank you, Amanda. Muchas gracias, señora Yadira Sanchez. Thank you, Yadira. Thank you, Amanda, for answering the questions, for participating with us today. I want to close by inviting everyone to also join us on May 7th for our Whole Learner Act webinar. I think that learning both about like the process is happening at a statewide level, but also at a national level are really going to benefit our community. So we are happy to share that space with everyone who joined us today. And also just to close, if you have any additional questions or you would like to get more information regarding the work with Abriendo Puertas, I know people requested more information about how they can get in touch with Abriendo Puertas and also get more involved. Feel free to visit our website and also reach out. I can add my information in the chat. My email is cgonzalez@ap-od.org. So feel free to send us an email and also let us know that you want to get involved and also send any additional questions that you may have. This is all for our webinar today, and we are grateful and honored to have our speakers share their experiences with us and to have you join us with your questions. Thank you. Have a nice day.